Good morning, everybody. So fascinating. Great start to the second day. My name is Maria Rasa. I'm your moderator today. I'm from the Philippines. Our session is Twiplomacy, Public Policy in 140 Characters. I'm looking forward to speaking to our esteemed panel. And also, hopefully, we'll have a chance to get more questions from the audience in. So let me call them up on stage. You're going to first hear a presentation from a man you've seen a few times, Matthias. Matthias Lufkens is going to be giving a presentation that will trigger what we discuss. So Matthias, please come on up. Let me call up also the panelists who are going to be with us today. Jan Milson. We were on the first panel together, so I'm looking forward also to hearing from him. And then finally, Maurice Vergier. Please come on up. And I'm going to give the panel the podium over, or the microphone, to Matthias.
Thank you very much. Shall I do this standing up or on the podium? Well, we'll do it from here. Yes, so thank you very much, Maria. So I'm Matthias Lufkens. I'm the founder and main author of the Twiplomacy study. For those of you who haven't heard about this, basically we're looking at how governments, heads of states and heads of government and foreign ministers use social media. It started in 2012, mainly focused on Twitter, hence the name Twitter and diplomacy, Twiplomacy. But we've expanded to Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, Google+, and even Snapchat, Instagram and Snapchat. And I'll talk a little bit about that. What we're seeing this year, 2017, so 5 years on, 92% of all governments, of the 193 UN governments, have a Twitter presence, either institutional or personal, of their leaders. Here you can see some of them. Facebook is the second most used social network. And what's quite interesting is that with, I think, 88% of all UN governments have an official Facebook presence. What's interesting, we've identified 850, now 890 Twitter accounts, and the median average number of followers on these accounts is 15,000, if you look at all of them. Compare that to Facebook, where the median average number is double as much, it's 38,000. I find that quite interesting. In third position is YouTube. Obviously, quite a number of governments have YouTube presence, 76%, but Instagram is coming up very fast, with 3/4 of UN governments having a presence now on Instagram, which I think is quite interesting for visual communications. And then lastly, 30 governments or leaders have a presence on Snapchat. You're asking me, Snapchat, isn't that, why is someone on Snapchat? I'll always take the example of the Argentinian president, Mauricio Macri. He was elected 2 years ago. He's on Snapchat. In 4 years' time, there will be elections, and the kids who are now on Snapchat will be able to vote. So I think it's a great way to reach out to that younger audience. And we'll see an example later on. So Twiplomacy, what is really interesting, and as I said, 92% of all the UN governments have a presence, and that translates into 145 personal Twitter accounts of presidents and prime ministers. Obviously, not all of them are tweeting personally. They do have teams to do that. There is 117 foreign ministers with personal accounts. Sorry, foreign ministries with accounts, and 91 foreign ministers have personal accounts. And they have put, over the past years, their diplomatic missions on the platform. We've counted 4,262 diplomatic missions. There's a public Twitter list on the Twiplomacy Twitter account, which you can see, and 1,184 ambassadors with personal accounts. So Twitter is really the digital network of diplomats for digital diplomacy. And what is quite interesting is in the study is not who has the most followers, but what I really think is the most important, who has the most mutual connections. So for those of you on Twitter, if you follow someone, the person follows you back, you will have a second layer of communications via direct messages. And that is very, very powerful. You can then direct message the other follower. And the external actions, the EU External Action Service, that's the foreign policy branch of the European Union, is the best connected with 129 mutual connections. In second position, the Russian Foreign Ministry, really keen on creating these connections, then the Germans and the UK Foreign Office, but then also smaller countries, Norway and Iceland. And Iceland reacted to our study. The foreign ministry tweeted this: see, size really doesn't matter. So as a small country, using these digital tools, you can actually be on par with the big guys. So I thought that reaction was quite interesting. And it's really the state of the mutual relations on Twitter really shows you the state of their diplomatic relations. What's quite interesting, so we've created this Twitter account 5 years ago, which I'm very proud of, at Twiplomacy, which now has 50,000 followers, which is quite impressive, I have to say. But more impressive is I have 2,100 other verified accounts following this account. And that is quite high. If you have a verified account, you can check how many verified followers follow you. And I think 2,000 is pretty good. And what is even better, if we look at the other accounts that world leaders follow, number one is the UN. 338 heads of state and government follow the UN. Barack Obama, not surprisingly, in second position. I mean, he is the digital president. The Obama White House followed by 250. Then UNICEF, the New York Times, and right after the New York Times with 184, this Twiplomacy account. And actually, we do direct message these world leaders once a year, basically to announce the next study is coming out, and we do get quite a bit of positive reactions, and nobody has unfollowed us since. Obviously, for the media, they want to know who's the most followed. Well, I can tell you, until now, Pope Francis is the most followed world leader if you add up all his 9 language accounts. The Pope tweets in English, but the Spanish account is actually most followed, but also in Italian, in Polish, in German, in French, in Portuguese, Italian, and Latin. And he has slightly more followers than Donald Trump. But in the next weeks, Donald Trump will actually overtake the Pope because his growth is stronger. And then, quite interestingly, the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and the institutional account, PMO India, and the institutional account of the US President and the White House account. So really, those are the biggest countries kind of really dominating here. And if we've heard yesterday, once the billion Indians come online, I'm pretty sure the Indian Prime Minister will become number one. So if we look at Asia, the president of Indonesia is the most followed in this part of the world, followed by Najib Razak, Prime Minister of Malaysia, the government of Japan, and the president of Korea. But what's interesting is the number of followers, frankly, is not really interesting. You want to know how effective are these world leaders. So we've looked at the number of interactions over the past 12 months. These figures date from May 2016 to May 2017. You look at that figure, Donald Trump had 166 million interactions on his tweets. That is 5 times as many as Narendra Modi, who is in second position with 35 million interactions. Those are figures which are absolutely incredible. And then 13 million for the Turkish president, and Pope Francis with 12 million. So those are really interesting figures. Now, we didn't do an analysis if these interactions were positive or negative. At least, their tweets hit home. If we look at the number of, and this is quite interesting, how effective are they in their tweets, actually it's the King of Saudi Arabia, King Salman, is very, very effective with 147,000 average retweets per tweet. Now, he has a very simple Twitter strategy. He doesn't tweet very often. He tweets probably every 3 months. But when he does, he breaks Twitter in Saudi Arabia, where Twitter penetration is quite high. And then look at that. That's 10 times as much as Donald Trump. He does get on average 13,000 retweets for his tweets, 10,000 for the Pope, and then 6,000 for the POTUS account. But beyond the figures, what is quite interesting is the use of the the US president, the use of this platform by the US president. He just tweeted a couple of minutes ago a tweet, big week ahead, exclamation mark. What does he mean? So, and we know he's actually himself who's tweeted it. So, yes, this is a cartoon from Patrick Chapat, the Swiss cartoonist, with Donald Trump. It's already dates. I think it's a year old, this illustration, and really showing that Twitter is a tool of mass engagement, just as much as the nuke button on his desk. And one of his most retweeted tweets, of course, is "Today we make America great again." Normally you should not write all caps online because that means really you're shouting. But what's quite interesting is what we looked at this year is how do world leaders, how do the others, governments, react to his tweets? So, first of all, since the election, few people, wanted to react. Like, for example, the UK government, the Foreign Office, did not react to Donald Trump when he suggested that Nigel Farage would make a great ambassador. So the UK Foreign Office said, well, we'll rather downplay that tweet and not react to it. So we've seen the French president making a stance very clearly with this "Make Our Planet Great Again" visual, which was shared on Twitter, on Facebook, and on Instagram. The French Foreign Office went a step further and actually used a White House video which explained why the Paris Climate Agreement was a bad deal, and they annotated it, basically taking that same video and saying leaving the Paris Accord is a bad deal for America and the world. So it's a great video. I'm not showing it to you, but have a look on their Twitter page of the French Foreign Office. Quite interesting reaction here among friends and allies. Also, one reply from Donald Tusk, the president of the European Commission, directly to Donald Trump, real Donald Trump, please don't change the political climate and the climate for worse. Very open, direct reply here. But very few leaders actually will engage directly with Donald Trump. Someone who did is the Mexican president. When they met back in September last year, Donald Trump tweeted, "Mexico will pay for the wall." Well, to that, the Mexican president replied, "I will repeat, as I said to you personally, Mexico will not pay for the wall." The problem here, he tweeted it in Spanish. I think it would have been even more effective if he had tweeted it in English, just as the French president did tweet it in English. The other world leaders will subtweet Donald Trump. What is subtweeting? Is basically you tweet on the same topic, but not directly replying to the US president. Here, the reaction of Justin Trudeau when Donald Trump announced the travel ban, basically hashtag "welcome to Canada." To those fleeing persecution, terror, and war, Canadians will welcome you regardless of your faith. Diversity is our strength. Very, very strong message. Similar message from Pope Francis. "I invite you not to build walls but bridges, to conquer evil with good, offense with forgiveness, to live in peace with everyone." So very strong subtweets here from other world leaders, and it's clear who they're addressed to. It's quite interesting. Some leaders will also, and this is especially true in the Nordics, you've all seen this picture, the Egyptian president, King Salman, and Donald Trump around this globe. Well, the Nordic prime minister decided we'll do the same. And here you have the Prime Minister of Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Finland, and Iceland holding this football and basically saying that they'll, for the development goals, their support, just days after this picture, which is quite interesting. And another picture, this is one of the most retweeted tweets on the official POTUS account, where he's signing, Donald Trump becomes president, and the deputy prime minister of Sweden, and Donald Trump often tweets these pictures where he signs bills. She actually got all her female staff around her to sign this. Once again, a very, kind of subtle, not so subtle parody of Donald Trump's tweets. So the other thing that we've looked at is how conversational are world leaders on Twitter. Do they reply to tweets? And the reply is an @reply, which will actually not be seen. If you start a tweet with an @ it will not be seen by all of your followers, but only the people who follow you and the other person you address. And here we can see, quite interesting, there's two governments really using it very well, the Dutch government and the government in Nepal. Most conversational leaders is the president of Rwanda, Paul Kagame. Every now and then he sits down and replies to whoever sends him greetings. It's quite interesting. Anna Solberg from Norway, really interacting with her followers, mainly in Norwegian, and also the Prime Minister of Rwanda. So those are quite interesting examples. But I wanted to talk about the Rijksoverheid, the official government account of the Dutch government here. And they will basically say on their Twitter profile, we're replying to your questions Monday to Friday from 8 to 8 in the evening. But also in the Nepalese government, the Office of the Prime Minister, Hello Sartka here, really opening to questions. 95% of their tweets are just replies to questions from their followers. So I find this, kind of really interesting, the use of this, opening up and engaging. And Hello Sarka, this Twitter account, you don't even need to follow them. You can send them a direct message. They have opened up a direct message, so anyone can send them a direct message, as does the Foreign Ministry here in Singapore. Once again, you can message them. I did actually message them. I haven't received a reply yet. But at least messages are open, which I think is quite interesting to engage, to interact with your followers. The other thing is, of course, what I hope world leaders will do is sit down for the occasional Twitter interview. They do press conferences. Well, they might also do Twitter interviews. There's the Austrian Foreign Minister, Sebastian Kurz, doing a Twitter chat. And here's the President of Kenya using Facebook Live to react to tweets and questions that have come in from his fans and followers on Facebook. And also, lastly, the President of Madagascar. Also, he has actually a channel called Le Rendezvous, which is on YouTube and Facebook, where he answers questions from his followers. And this kind of engagement, I think, is really exemplary, because they are using social media as a tool to govern rather than just to win elections. We've also looked, of course, at Periscope, which is the live broadcasting tool of Twitter. And the most followed is Donald Trump. But what's interesting, the most liked is actually the Turkish president and the official presidency account, really using Periscope for political rallies and broadcasting those live to his Twitter followers. The Russian Foreign Ministry is broadcasting the weekly press briefing of the spokesperson on Periscope. They also do this, of course, on their website in full HD quality, but you still get a couple of hundred people watching it also on Periscope. The French president used Periscope to make that statement he did about make the planet great again in English, so it's quite interesting use there. And the Swedish foreign minister on March 8th this year actually convened the first, I would say, the digital summit of female foreign ministers, here with the foreign minister of Kenya, Costa Rica, and Luxembourg, in a Google Hangout, which was broadcast live on Periscope, on Facebook Live, and on YouTube. So quite interesting here in this discussion, as everyone was able to speak. We've seen quite a few leaders, of course, sharing selfies. The Russian Premier Dmitry Medvedev here is working out every now and then to thank his followers on Instagram. Prime Minister Lee from the hospital bed, even, which is quite interesting. The French president, when he won the elections, he had to do a selfie with his team to thank them for the elections. But somebody who's really doing it well is, of course, the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Here he is in the Forbidden City in Beijing, taking a selfie with the Chinese premier. And what's interesting, as you all know, the Chinese government is not using Western or even Chinese social media channels. So that's quite interesting how Modi gets the Chinese president. So selfie diplomacy, Julie Bishop and with Boris Johnson here taking a selfie. I personally love selfies. It's much more engaging than a handshake, I think. So, I think this is a great way to engage. And of course, Najib Razak, the Prime Minister of Malaysia, is doing that. I think he's done it with most of the foreign leaders he meets here. He has King Salman in the car and Narendra Modi. And he even bought a selfie stick because, how do you want to engage large crowds? Well, use a selfie stick. And then somebody who's doing it really well. You've seen the picture in the beginning. This is the famous jump shot of Prime Minister Lee here. This one he reenacted because he did that. Look, at the age of 65, using social media the way he does it, I think is absolutely exemplary. And he did post recently a post where he explained his 5 years on Twitter and Facebook. When I ventured into Facebook and Twitter 5 years ago, I had no idea where they would take me. I didn't know either platform very well, but I thought it would be an interesting way to reach you, hear your thoughts, and share ideas on building a better home for us all. And I think this is a great example, of how a government leader uses social media in office. What's really interesting is with him is on Instagram he shares the hashtag guess where pictures, so guess where I am. It can be in Singapore or on foreign trips, which I really think is a great way to engage his audience. I wanted to talk very briefly about Snapchat, and this is just introduce the Canadian Prime Minister, because now it's no longer just Twitter. You have Twitter, Snapchat, Instagram, Facebook. How do you deal with covering all these channels? And this is just a couple of days ago, the official visit of the King of Jordan to Canada. So here you can see the flags. These are Snapchat stories. So these are still pictures. In 4 still pictures, they're telling the whole story. They're signing an agreement. They're about to go live for a press conference, and then the press conference, the shot from above. So in 4 pictures, you basically tell the story. Obviously, they're not live streaming the press conference on Snapchat, but it gives you an idea. And they actually did the same Instagram story on Instagram in 4 shots here. Instagram stories, which is a copy of Snapchat. Once again, the flags, the signing, and the press conference. On Instagram, this ended up as a shot now taken by the official photographer, a really nice shot, through kind of behind the scenes, where the 2 leaders talk together. So on Instagram, just one picture, 25,000 likes. And that same picture was also used on Facebook. And finally, on Twitter, you had, 2 pictures here. So this is kind of, what social media teams now have to do, basically service every single social media channel for an event. The UK Foreign Office had a great idea for the official royal visit of the Spanish king to London. They gave their Snapchat account to the UK ambassador. So there he is, getting ready. Off we go in the car, and basically taking a picture of the lunch menu, and then basically he's in the first row taking a picture of the Queen, of the King. So you have a whole series of pictures here telling the stories. Unfortunately, with Snapchat and Instagram stories, these stories disappear after 24 hours, so you won't be able to find this again. But I thought this is a great way to really empower other people to run the Snapchat account. So in part, as a end shot, I would like to quote the president of Namibia, who went onto Twitter with this tweet: "Be a leader, not a follower, LOL." So thank you very much. And with that, happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll turn it over to Jan, your reaction and your thoughts.
Thank you very much, Maria. Yes, it's wonderful to have this invitation by the Adenauer Stiftung to talk about this subject, which forces me to reflect on it. And reflecting on Twitter, I started really doing only yesterday evening, so my thoughts will be ripe and green. But I will certainly continue reflecting on this as I see the importance. And it's great again to sit next to the king of Twiplomacy on this issue. I'm wondering, though, technology is moving so fast. Where are we going to be 10 years from now? Will this look like we see now Dwight Eisenhower in the 1950s on black and white television? It may be. Things are going very, very, very fast. Twiplomacy is interesting. It's not just for the leaders, and what I understand from what others have said, but it is basically for elites. As Matthias said, it's a diplomatic medium. So the interesting thing is that the president of all populist presidents, Mr. Trump is using a medium that is basically used by elites rather than the masses. I've not fully worked that out, but it's an interesting one. He's doing that, and we see that the elites are using Twitter, the leaders are using Twitter, but of course the mediators are also using Twitter. And I think there are two varieties of mediators, one the journalists, and the other ones the diplomats. And I'm interested in the diplomats. And I realize that many diplomats are voluntarily on Twitter, but not all of them are voluntarily on Twitter. Actually, there is a kind of a discipline within foreign ministries where foreign ministers tell their staff, you have to be on Twitter. Now that can be quite a chore, as it is an enormous chore for the journalists to be on all these different platforms for a small salary and little time. Equally for diplomats, it's quite a chore to do this basically 10 p.m. on the sofa at home. And what if this is not showing up in your appraisal talk? What is your incentive to be on Twitter? Is there any at all? Well, I think today all diplomats should be on Twitter, but many of them are invisible. The good old faceless diplomats using Twitter as a resource. That's actually what persuaded me in less than 5 minutes that I should be on Twitter. I started using Twitter, I found information I didn't find before, and I thought, well, this is really good. Now I'm also suffering slightly from the discipline, because when you're active on Twitter, it is actually a rigorous discipline on a daily basis. Twitter is a tool that we use. I think it could also be seen as something that is used in a digital environment where diplomacy is enacted, and that increasingly we have people on this planet who are living digital lives. So we're talking about a digital condition, and these are three steps really, three sort of stages, depths in which we can interpret the use of this medium. I've never really looked deep into critical analysis of Twitter, but I think we have to remind ourselves of two things. One, Twitter is a company. And my father and mother taught me that companies are on this planet to make money. Twitter also wants to make money. Twitter has a certain ethics. They don't do business with governments, but they do sell their data to companies. And the companies sell those data again to governments. So I've not looked into this, but I think as journalists, as critical analysts, we have an obligation to look into this side of things, because what's become clear in the discussions here is the enormous power of the big American platforms. And we, naive Westerners, seem to be so happy about what American companies bring to us. But as we know, it's not all for free. Some of the new businesses transform the economy, and a lot of that money is going to certain places you can imagine where. So a critical attitude towards Twitter. I think also particularly in the Asian setting, it would be good to remind ourselves of the fact that the Western platforms may not be the most sophisticated ones compared to Asian ones, like Line, like KakaoTalk, and that there needs to be a discussion about these different kinds of platforms, why people use them, how they use them, or how countries are or are not successful in exporting these platforms. KakaoTalk, for instance, is a Korean messenger that is quite popular wider in Asia, and same is true for Line. So it's not just a Western discussion, it's not just a discussion about American media available for all. As I said, I'm interested in how diplomats use this medium, and initially I thought this was all hype, but I had to eat my words gradually. And first time I heard Matthias talking about Twiplomacy, I thought, well, it's really about talking to your electorate. This is not about international relations. So, in my humility, Matthias, I have to confess now that you were right before I saw how this has become a tool in international relations. And also at the lower level of diplomacy, which is perhaps slightly more fascinating than all these ranting leaders who are decreasingly believed because of what they say on Twitter. I think the diplomatic value of the American president, what he says on Twitter, like what he now says about North Korea, who really still believes that those are credible threats? So there is a certain inflation of the diplomatic value of the words of the diplomat-in-chief, the highest political authority in the United States, who, as we learned from the previous session, is mainly an entertainer, or first of all, an entertainer with an awful lot of power. So at a lower level, briefly, if I may, what is Twitter used for? Information gathering is, of course, very important. I already mentioned that. But Twitter is also used for other policy purposes, and I think that is the beauty of the medium, that it can actually be used to help people to do good things in foreign policy and to do good things on a global scale. Well known is that at the time of Nepal, many, and I may have mentioned that yesterday, many governments used Twitter, were immediately on Twitter to find their citizens. So that is actually revolutionary in the world of diplomacy, where information channels that are public channels are privileged over government-controlled, closed information channels. Twitter is also used to crowdsource information. So this is where, which is originally, some time ago, this was thought as not diplomacy, helping citizens abroad. Now it's one of the core functions of foreign ministries, and that is perhaps more than in public diplomacy, where we saw the rise of these media, these social media like Twitter. Of course, also in public diplomacy I can be sure reaching out to foreign populations. And the dark side of it, we've seen how these media can also be used to reach out to the networks of what I called yesterday your enemies. So to use social media to go into the networks of others. In the core function of diplomacy is negotiation. It's the hardcore of diplomacy. And this is again where social media are very much present, because negotiation takes place long before people meet at the negotiation table, and the framing of issues, the pre-negotiation or circum-negotiation, is very much something in the public sphere. So what we are talking about, what will eventually be on the table, is being decided in the public sphere, and that is where this medium is doing a wonderful job. In negotiations, even secret negotiations like the Iran nuclear talks, at some point Twitter was there. In multilateral talks that have become talks not just between states, but a whole range of different actors, Twitter is going completely wild. At COP21, an app was made available, the COP21 Negotiator, which provided a lot of information about the negotiations, which tells us, shows us another thing, how digital media can be used to know a lot about negotiations, about your own knowledge as well. So I should stop with this, but it's just the basic message is all functions of diplomacy. We see that Twitter comes in and other digital media in one way or another. I personally find it's a wonderful thing how we see how these media have been used in official development aid. Digital for development is not just a wonderful thing, but we see how when farmers can use their mobile phones to see market prices, or vulnerable groups, how pregnant women can use via their mobile phone, can make use of information they need for their health and safety. So Twitter, then finally, just a couple of words on the leaders. And that is just a couple of comments, because as I said, I need to reflect more on this, but I do have a feeling that a lot of this leader activity we actually see an erosion of the value of their words, the credibility of what they say, and there is a lot of nervosity, because where the US president on Twitter is driving policy via Twitter, we can feel how his own apparatus feels sort of completely bypassed by the neglected by the leader in command who wants to react instantly, but we also see very nervous allies. There are countries in the world, also in Asia, let's think of Japan or South Korea, who in their foreign policy, the relationship with the United States is a pillar of everything they stand for in their foreign relationships. Now, when that pillar starts shaking, and when the leader of your main ally becomes so unpredictable, this is making people restless about where this can lead us in international relations. And of course, we all prefer this to run smoothly rather than to have unpleasant surprises. There's more to say about this, but as I said, I need to reflect on it. Two things about the future. One, I think Twitter and other of these media can help us in explaining complexity. And I'm borrowing the words from Mr. Rees in the previous section. Explaining complexity is an important task, and that's where we need all help we can find, including a medium like Twitter. Because after all, it's not just the message, but often also the link with the message that is leading us to explaining complexity in relatively simple ways. Finally, I'm still in a way with some of my initial doubts about Twiplomacy. And some of those initial doubts are whether there is all that much dialogue to this. And a week is a long time in politics. The issues change very quickly. And there is the primacy of domestic politics over international relations. Basically, is my political scientists feeling what leaders are after who are on Twitter is not creating a better world, but creating another period in government. Thank you.
Interesting. Yay. So let's get a reaction and your thoughts also, Maurice. You've written a lot about public diplomacy on social media.
Thank you, Maria. Well, to be honest, I'm not an expert on Twitter and diplomacy. Well, on Twitter, but not on diplomacy. But it's related, of course, to political communication. And as such, I can share you my opinion. Just to link up to your final comment about the conversational issue on Twitter, basically there is very little conversation on Twitter because mostly because many politicians are becoming quite popular in a very rapid time. And the more popular they are, the less likely it becomes for them to reply or to set up a conversation with other people, simply because, well, there are too many reactions to them. Well, I hope that world leaders do not have that much time to spend all day on Twitter. They have far more important things to do. But there are some issues on Twitter and diplomacy that are relevant. To some extent, of course, you can look at Twitter and diplomacy as sort of a customer care. This sounds maybe a bit strange, but compare, for instance, yet another, well, I'm not comparing the Dutch government with a company, but KLM is said to have the most renowned customer care on Twitter, stating, "We will reply to your tweet within 1 hour, and every problem will be solved online." So if a customer announces a problem with a reservation, solving the problem will be all online as well. And of course, this is for public image very important, that of course there will be a problem, but the solution will also be online for people to see. And if a government does this, and apparently the Dutch government does this very well, it's online as well. Of course, it's a bit strange that it's only from 8 to 8. I mean, Twitter particularly is a medium that is being used in front of the TV, and as such in the evening hours. So in that sense, they're bureaucrats still. Turning to Twitter as a personal medium, you said about the adoption of Twitter, that not all diplomats are likely to, first of all, adopt Twitter, and sometimes they must because of their boss. And if they do, they are quite reluctant to use Twitter. And this is, of course, a serious issue, because Twitter is a very personalized medium. And the past has shown that if you are not sincere on using Twitter, this can really backfire. There's a real, it basically turned into an internet meme. David Cameron tweeting, "I just got off the phone with Barack Obama." And well, everybody, like high-profile other Twitters, like Patrick Stewart, imitated him. Whoa, 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 David Cameron is apparently very important because he just got off the phone with Barack Obama. So this really backfired because they didn't feel it was really sincere. And people noticed this quite quickly. So if diplomats and officials are going to use Twitter, please do it because you like to do it, because you think Twitter is a good medium, and almost do it like a private medium. Of course, with all the reservations in terms of, well, doing this in the function of a diplomat. But doing it because your boss tells you to do it is not a good motivation, and probably will backfire in the long run. But it can have positive effects as well, using Twitter as a personal medium, because mostly modern societies suffer from a great problem, and this is the lack of trust in politicians and in world leaders. Because they are in the state capital, they are doing their complicated business, having important meetings, and people really think, well, I'm not sure they're working for us. So there's an increasing distrust in politics and politicians all across the world. And one beneficial factor of social media in general, whether it's Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter, is that it gives people and citizens an insight in the personal life of these world leaders. If it's a basketball game by Barack Obama in his front yard, or visiting your grandchildren, those kind of things show, hey, these world leaders are also only humans of flesh and blood. And they're not that different from me. Okay, they have a more important job than me, and they sometimes make more money than I do, but they're a bit like me. So maybe that makes them more likable than when they would not use social media. At the same time, and research is not conclusive about that, world leaders and politicians also have a certain stature. There needs to be some authority. And authority at the same time creates distance again. So it's a bit of a mixed bag, social media creating less distance, but at the same time the distance should not disappear because you have more authority. For instance, if we have a king, if our king were to start using Twitter, I'm not sure that would be a great idea. I mean, he is a person of stature and would lower himself basically to the level of the people, of the commons, so to speak, and that would not be good for the queen and for the king. A final word about an aspect of Twitter and social media in general is that, and I find this an interesting aspect of Twitter and diplomacy. Remember a few years ago when WikiLeaks disclosed all cables of the US government, and it became all public and everybody was able to analyze it. And diplomats were very concerned because they said, well, we have an important job. Of course, they think they have an important job, and they do. But, and they said, well, this basically destroys years of work, building trust, etc. And to some extent, we need to do our work in private or even in secrecy. And publishing these cables makes our work quite difficult. And Twitter, of course, is, well, one of the most public media ever. And I'm not sure how this relates to the public and the private or secret dialogue diplomats conduct. Of course, Twitter is mostly about public relations, but also about social causes, calling for relief efforts in natural disasters is of course an important aspect of social media. But I'm not sure what the effectiveness is of Twitter in terms of diplomacy, in terms of getting people where they're at. Basically.
I think that's a great question to end with. And of course, Matthias, back at you. How effective has Twiplomacy been?
Well, I just want to, say, okay, Twitter, a tweet is 140 characters. It's a headline, nothing more. And, if there's a link, it's like a headline, you want to read more. And headlines are often actually shorter than 140 characters. Putting diplomats on Twitter doesn't mean they will share what they had for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, or that they will basically open private conversations. That's, that's not the social media. Social media will not open this. It will definitely give an insight into, how, into their lives, into their private lives. And, the Obama administration did that very well with the official photographer, Pete Souza, on the Instagram account of the White House at the time. Now what we're seeing on the US president's Instagram account is pictures of his tweets. Not very visual, so I think it's putting diplomats onto social media. I think forcing them onto social media is very, very important because we're at least my generation digital immigrants, so that they understand what it is about. Now, do they have to be active? No, they can just basically use Twitter just to read, to monitor, because the news is breaking on Twitter with the tweets, especially now from the US president. And one thing I've always advocated, the personal use of social media by our leaders. Not that I want them to tweet every day and 5 times a day, but very much the Barack Obama approach, which was very well curated tweets and messages, not very often, but when he did, he really broke the internet. So I think that's really what we see today is a US president who's freely using the tool without any oversight or control, or at least consulting with his advisors, and that's the scary part. What's the next tweet that's coming out from the president? And, the president of the United States, and this is where which is probably not the best advertisement for Twitter or social media engagement of leaders.
When you first formulated Twiplomacy, when you thought about that, it was a very, very different age. Jan was mentioning this a few generations back. I guess what lessons, the dangers and the victories that you've seen in that time period? I mean, I would say there have been at least 5 different permutations of Twitter.
I mean, it was kind of, starting in 2012, you had the Russian president at the time, Medvedev, Barack Obama. It was, I would really say, it's the whole Barack Obama era.
Which
Obama
was the whole optimism
exactly.
of
But
social media.
he set up Twitter in 2007, very early on, for the elections in 2008. He was still senator of Illinois, and then used it very effectively during the presidential campaign in 2008, then again in 2012, and he put all the administration, the White House administration, onto Twitter, onto Facebook too. So kind of, and what we saw, Carl Bildt, for example, Swedish foreign minister, using it and using it personally without consulting with his staff. But he kind of knew, the diplomatic line. So, they would wake up in the morning, see what did he tweet overnight, but, without consulting. So then you had the Estonian president, now very outspoken. Now, Thomas Henrik Ilves, he didn't have an his position as president is more ceremonial. So he has kind of a liberty to speak, which he used on Twitter. And what we saw is really these connections, these chats. Now what we see is more, kind of very aggressive tweets. You can see these tweets from the Russian embassy in the US that I would invite you to follow if you want to know Russian position, or the more funny tweets from the Russian embassy in the UK, really kind of very confrontational. So I think that's really sad. But it's 140 characters. This is the official statements coming out from these governments. So what we've lost is really this dialogue, and I do fully agree with you. There is not much dialogue on Twitter. I wish there was more. But I love it how some of them use it, the Dutch government, the Nepalese government as a CRM, customer relation tool. The German government does that on their Facebook page, which I find quite interesting.
So I'll take it forward and kind of incorporate our last panel in this, and I'd love to get your thoughts, gentlemen, on this. When I was talking generations, I was talking in terms of bots, in terms of disinformation on Twitter. There's an arms race on Twitter, and Twitter, by the way, is far more transparent a platform than the other social media, certainly far more than Facebook. So you can see it, and the API allows you to do that. And yes, you can buy the data, which then can be mined by anyone in this room, right? So as this arms race of bots have gone on, it was interesting with the heads of state that you had there, Peña from Mexico. Bots are so prevalent in Mexico, they're calling them Peña bots. Erdogan, the leaders. How much of it, I guess, is, in your minds, how much of it is positive? How much is negative? That's too broad. But for you, I know Twiplomacy, when you first came out with it, we were also, again, in that optimism of the Obama use of social media. But I think, as you pointed out, with the use of anger, with the use of hate, part of the disinformation that comes through are the bots that tend to stifle ordinary people. Your thoughts?
Look, we've looked at some of these leaders. The numbers are truly magical, but I have I cannot pinpoint any leader using bots to increase the number of their followers or to increase the reach of their tweets. Some of them, I'm a bit suspicious, but I have absolutely no proof of anything. Other governments will very publicly promote tweets. So the French government had an issue, kind of to keep young Frenchmen enlisting for ISIS. So basically, they really pushed that message on social media platforms as a promoted, sponsored tweet. The Japanese government did that too, so which is absolutely legitimate. So I don't see any kind of consistent activity, and in some countries, that Twitter penetration is massive, and they have lots of followers, and Donald Trump has lots of followers and people who will tweet for him and retweet every single message. But they're not necessarily bots.
So I'd like to make a related point about this, and that is that it's very much about legitimacy, and what has been mentioned, that the personal authenticity is so important in Twitter. But the legitimacy is often also not with the leader, but in society. And there is a trend where countries are mobilizing groups in civil society to actually use social media on their behalf. It could be called a sort of citizen diplomacy, where the assumption is that what citizen groups do is aligned with the government line. And a few examples of that are, for instance, in Israel, where young people are trained to be active in social media on behalf of the government, so as more effective citizen ambassadors than the real ambassadors. Similarly, We see in a country like South Korea, where, mind you, individual diplomats in most of Asia are not supposed to be on Twitter. Let's not try and stick our Western format on the whole world. But in South Korea, where the government and the foreign ministry have a very deliberate policy of giving money to NGOs that use social media to be active out there, and of course on the assumption that this is in the interests of government. The beauty of Twitter, I think, is for MFAs, and the good news is that it makes diplomacy visible. How do you make a picture of diplomacy? The security people have it easy. Everything about security of defense can be visualized with an aircraft carrier, with a plane, or whatever, with people in need. But diplomacy is hard to visualize. So it really brings people. Twitter has the good news for individual diplomats and ambassadors using it, that they can actually show their profession. And the good point you made about WikiLeaks, Maurice, is that it shows under the surface. It gives an opportunity to go into the black box of international relations. Because diplomacy, as the first words when I talk to my students, is the engine room of international politics. But the engine room is invisible. It's below the deck. And Twitter helps us to see below that deck and see what is going on. And in that apparatus, and that's my final point on this aspect, the embassies have often been outposts, as Harold Nicholson said famously, clerks at the end of a line. Very different right now. The outposts, the eyes and the ears, the embassies are very important. Social media give the embassies a great opportunity to deliver input in policy making at the center, and makes them much more visible also for local populations. So yes, it can be actually quite a great tool.
Maurice, thoughts?
I know that the Dutch government asked for an investigation on the use of so-called superhubs on Twitter. Superhubs are people or organizations, or at least Twitter accounts, that are massively followed. To utilize these, of course in collaboration, for the dissemination of public service messages. These popular accounts are, of course, I hope, trusted accounts, and of course the government is responsible for choosing which superhub to use. But this is similarly to using NGOs, a very intelligent way of using Twitter to get a message across. Of course, the Dutch government has customer care. I'm not following that account, and I assume many people don't. So it's much better to use these so-called superhubs. These are trusted accounts, and with one message, one retweet by such a superhub, vast majorities of populations can be reached. Not only that, because it's a trusted superhub, the impact and the engagement of such a tweet and such a message is far greater. Or let's put it this way, that's the theory. But this is a relatively new approach. Most of the finances, the budgets for public service announcements and external communications are via traditional channels. So whether this is really effective, I'm not sure yet, but it's worth looking into.
It's definitely important to go beyond that diplomatic community. If you want to have a lasting impact and effect, it's not only to tweet in the diplomatic community and, like, for example, all the accounts in New York, overnight, they were tweeting about North Korea and the UN Security Council, but that's kind of in the bubble, and you really want to break out of that. You want to, so yes, using superhubs, using influencers outside of that diplomatic sphere, I think is very, very important. So yeah, definitely. One last thing I wanted to add about the negotiations. You mentioned Iran, the Iran negotiations. Actually, during those negotiations, Twitter was banned. They basically decided, let's not make any statements on Twitter, because it would have scuppered the negotiations. And then they've decided at the end who will tweet first, the outcome. and then everybody else could tweet about it. So it's really important there to see how now people say, is there a microphone in the room? Please, don't tweet about this. This is off the record.
And curious, before we open it up to the audience, so please start thinking about your questions. You're up next. The last part is using, again, the bots. There's so much data that is coming out that it has been like a whack-a-mole, because as they come up, as Twitter comes up with new bots, with new ways to fight the bots, then there's a new wave, a new generation of bots that come to circumvent it. In terms of Donald Trump and the Senate Intelligence Committee, the kind of investigations that are going on in the United States in terms of connection to information warfare and perhaps Russia in this. Do you see any kind of the way information warfare could be used? I mean, in our part of the world, or actually in the US, actually Europe is a little bit more civilized on social media than our part right now. But I would say astroturfing, right? Creating artificial consensus or artificial realities, working with a leader like Donald Trump on Twitter.
Well, we've seen this bot attack. These Russian bots just recently attacking, really junking Twitter in the Baltic states and in Poland, where 75% of the mentions about NATO and the Baltic states were, from Russian bot accounts. I want Twitter to crack down on these, and they have to crack down on these. Very simple. Anyone who has a Twitter account has to have a verified email address and a verified telephone number. And with that, you will, eliminate thousands, hundreds of thousands of bots very, very easily. But of course, that will bring down Twitter's overall numbers quite a bit, but it will really raise the quality, I think, of the conversation, and they really have to address this issue. At least, if you don't want to delete these accounts, kind of drown them, because Twitter does have an algorithm. What we see depends on who we follow. So, if you drown these accounts that they are not prominent, just look at the hashtag of this conference. It has been successful. We see that because we do get spam on the ACPC 17 hashtag, which is
the one that's telling you to get 10,000 more followers for a certain amount.
Exactly. So, it's a huge problem for Twitter, and I hope they will address that soon. So, yeah.
Could it get in the way of Twiplomacy? So far, we haven't seen anything completely negative, right? I mean, but with the world's powerful leader, most powerful, on there, making these types of statements, do you see a danger?
Well, I do. With the Twiplomacy account, every now and then, the account is tagged in tweets which go viral, and then I do get all the vitriol, all the hate tweets and so on, but you can now mute that conversation on that specific tweet. You probably know, you've been victim of that. So it is really annoying, So it does, I do have to agree. I'm, tweeting a bit less than before. Not as active as I was before. You said you went on Twitter holidays. It can sometimes be annoying, and I hope it will not, destroy the beautiful platform that we have of international, engagement and this diplomatic across borders, because I think that is still, it can be very effective, and it's very effective for international organizations. Also, to reach the right people, to reach the influencers.
If I might just chip in on that, what is Twitter coming of age going to look like? I really do not have the answer yet, but I think we have some provisional answers. And what's coming out of this panel also is that it is a medium which is very good for broadcasting. It is less effective for dialogue, which inherently, we are told, is what social media are for. Will Twitter be successful when it goes down from the elites to a broader use by the general public? I think that indeed would be a sign of it being more effective. But we are also perhaps in the post-euphoric stage of social media, where we realize it's not just empowering individuals and do-gooders in this world and NGOs, but it's also empowering the baddies. And it's empowering governments, astute authoritarian governments, who can use this actually as an instrument of control over their own population, as a sophisticated instrument to create a more perfect form of authoritarianism. And in international relations, we can see that it's not perhaps uniquely a force for the good. When we put our ear on the ground and we look at what new generations think of this, I'm not too confident that Twitter, not yet convinced. However much I would like this to be a medium to continue as it does, doing good things, but I also see young people getting very worried about surveillance and getting very worried about how precisely these social media are not contributing to their liberation, but is actually giving others a way to monitor what they are doing. And it instills distrust because of the bots and what you were saying, Maria, and you know a lot more about this than the three gentlemen on this panel, about the bots, that what people read, people wonder what's the value still of, where does the information come from, what's the truth in that information. So I think it's a whole melee of things that are happening at the moment. I personally still see the positive sides of Twitter, which probably are related to the way I use the medium myself.
And the same, yeah, Maurice, and then we'll take questions from.
About the future of Twitter, of course, Twitter as a platform is stabilizing in the number of users, and I do think that doesn't need to be a bad thing. That's correct. At the same time, there needs to be a sustainable number of people using it to keep it alive, or at least keep it a viable business, because the service needs to be kept up and running. But we're talking about bots and algorithms, but even without looking at these bots and algorithms, we really still do not know how these social networks, or even online social networks, really are. What is the effect of a retweet? What is the effect of a tweet in the morning or in the evening? What is the effect of using a certain word on retweets? All these kind of things are still, for academics, a black box. Of course, we know some things, like there's a process called homophily.
Like attracts like.
Exactly, the love for the same. And this means that, Twitter is considered a platform polarization. But basically, yeah, that sounds negative, but at the same time, it's a natural process that happens offline as well. But for conversations, of course, it's true discussions. This needs to be opened up, and how to open up these closed circles, basically, whether it's offline or online, is quite difficult to understand, and how to set up these connecting relations between these echo chambers, so to speak. So I think whether it's for Twiplomacy or political communication or commercial communication, social media, the social aspect of media, is really not yet fully understood, and at least I hope, and I have self-interested that Twitter will keep alive for further study, whether it's for purely the social networks or Twiplomacy or political communication.
Okay, thank you. It's actually, I hope we all have question from the audience. Please tell us your name and the question. Who you would like to ask.
Hi, my name is Junie Lau, and I'm an independent TV journalist as well as producer and media trainer. Thanks for the great comments and lots of food for thought. Coming from my background as a TV journalist, I mean, we're painfully aware of made-for-television events, and it seems now that we are seeing the rise of made-for-social media events, whether it's to put out that message or to manipulate the message that the media receives, or whether the public receives it, and obviously a lot of these events are attended by the public as well. I mean, to what extent are we seeing this sort of orchestration going on? That's one thing. The other thing is, you know, in the last 5 to 7 years, at least in Singapore, a lot of my newsroom colleagues would be complaining about having to, you know, the social media is no longer social, it's no longer a fun thing to do. They had to actually start following politicians for work, you know, and it was no longer that fun anymore. But the other thing is, you know, and as we know, in the good old days, you know, foreign ministry, diplomats would carefully craft and calibrate those political statements that were issued by the MFA. And you know, as journalists, we look very carefully. We scrutinize every line. We try and read between, you know, the lines and for that messaging. But of course, these days, you know, politicians are very sort of cavalier sometimes about their messages. To what extent and how do we? What sort of weight do we place on such messages in the public sphere?
Yes, I'm happy to comment on the second aspect that you mentioned, the use of language. It is actually in most foreign ministries that I know, induction training of junior diplomats pays a lot of information to the kind of language that diplomats are using. Because diplomacy is increasingly a profession that is supposed to take place in the open domain. A physical manifestation of that in the architecture of the Dutch foreign ministry, which has just moved about 500 meters from one building to another, is that there are seats, office seats, for half of the staff. The other staff is supposed to be out there in meetings, on the streets, wherever, but not glued to their screens. And when you go to other places, you have to use other language than diplomatic language. You have to make yourself to enhance your value to those with whom you work with what you know, what you contribute to the cause that you're working for together. And that's where language is, of course, very, very, very important. So I think the whole language issue that social media has catapulted the importance of use of common language, language that everybody understands. And it brings us back to the broader issue of how the populists can explain things in ways people understand. This is an issue for everybody. This is an issue for politicians, but this is also an issue for others, because language is often not inclusive, but as you of course know much better than I do as a journalist, language can be totally exclusive. And perhaps the necessity to reach broad audiences in these media also creates change in diplomacy, in the language of diplomacy. It's being more accessible and understandable to everybody. The issues are not going to be less complex, they're going to be more complex. But coming back to those words mentioned in the earlier panel, explaining complexity is what Twitter is very good for. One thing I learned myself when I started using Twitter is I felt a kind of journalistic self-training in writing good headlines. Because really you have to write that good headline all of the time and convey meaningful content. How do you extract from a discussion that you're listening to precisely that captures the imagination of those who read your tweet? So there's good discipline, I think, in all this, also for those people who used to hide behind the codes and norms and language of their own profession. They're now out there in the public sphere.
Yeah, and that language is quite important. I see quite a few tweets. Whenever there's a big international event, you'll have some leaders and say, you know, read my statement on, or read the Prime Minister's statement on this. This is like, no, don't share that on Twitter. Give me the one personal line, and then, you know, the link to read the full press release, you know, but it's kind of it's a new language, and not everybody will be able to do this, you know, to get that personal statement. But it's like the soundbite on TV. It's nothing new, you know. It's not Twitter that introduced the short, pithy statement. So I think this is quite important. And your first question was to
orchestration. Yeah, orchestration.
I mean, absolutely. You know, look, a Twitter interview is one of the safest, you know, interview you can do, because, you know, you get the questions in writing beforehand, you know, and you're not obliged to answer immediately. You know, you can say, that question, let's figure out what we answer. You know, I mean, of course, that normally Twitter interviews are not filmed. Now with live events, it's quite different. Live Facebook lives or Periscope lives, very, very few leaders will actually do this. The president of Honduras does, on his mobile phone. He's live on Facebook Live and seeing the comments coming in. Now that is, quite interesting, to do this. Angela Merkel did just the other week. She did a YouTube interview with 4 German YouTubers. Now she chose. They basically suggested 4 lifestyle YouTubers, bloggers, not necessarily political journalists, but it was live, and she didn't have the questions beforehand. So quite a interesting high wire act. She came out quite well, although of course if you're a 60-year-old government leader against a 20-year-old young blogger, whatever you want to do, I mean there's old and new, so it's quite interesting that she did that. And yes, so the media talked about it, and she came out quite well. But of course you can orchestrate these events, and not every leader will be happy to go live on a Facebook Live. But for me, it's like a press conference. You never know which question comes out from left wing, right wing that you weren't prepared for.
Any other questions? While you're thinking of your question, Jan, I just remembered what you said about whether Twitter, in our part of the world, 2 of the top 5 cities on Twitter are in our part of the world, in Indonesia. Number 1 is Jakarta, number 5 was Bandung, right? So it's, Indonesian. So it's actually used, and in the last elections with Prabowo and Jokowi, Prabowo spent significant amounts on Twitter in particular, and Prabowo won it. Jokowi won it just that last weekend with a Twitter photo of this crowded concert. Right, it was a concert. That's what won it. That was decisive. So it won an election there.
Yeah. Could I just make just a little comment
Please.
on that? Of course, Asia is the most digitally vibrant part of the world. There's no doubt about this. What I find intriguing looking at diplomacy and diplomats, that the way in Western foreign ministries, people get commands from the top.
Yes.
They are ordered from the top to have their personal accounts. This is different in many Asian countries, where individual diplomats are not personally very active, as I understand, in these media. And I think the jury is still out whether in a number of years' time we're going to conclude whether that actually was a waste of time to have individual diplomats on Twitter, or whether Asian countries are going to follow what's now increasingly common practice in the West. I don't know. But I think it's good to keep our eyes open to the fact there's not just one way.
Yeah. But I've seen over the past weeks, the Malaysian Foreign Ministry has put their embassies on Twitter, and it seems like it's a top-down decision because I've seen them all cropping up. There is a country in Western Europe, I do work in Switzerland, where neither the Foreign Ministry, nor the Foreign Minister, nor the ambassadors are on social media. There's only about 5 missions who have a Twitter account, and then some have a Facebook page, but the ambassadors are not allowed to tweet. Just as the Russian Foreign Ministry has, no Russian ambassador is allowed to tweet. The exception is the Russian ambassador in the UK, and his tweets do make headlines. So it's, it's not every foreign ministry is embracing, the openness on social media. The UK Foreign Office definitely really encouraging. You can't be an ambassador in the UK if you don't have your Twitter account.
Any questions? We've got 6 minutes left. Please, a mic right behind you.
My name is Astrid Langer. I'm a journalist from Switzerland, and I'm wondering how fit do you think are Twitter and Facebook to reach young voters or get young people engaged in politics? Thank you.
Well, young voters, you will find them on Snapchat and Instagram, not on Twitter, and probably not on Facebook. But Snapchat is, the verdict is out. Will Snapchat survive the Instagram onslaught? Because Instagram really copied Snapchat. I think it's quite interesting. Snapchat and Instagram stories is probably the best, the safest way you can do social media. Because on Snapchat and on Instagram stories, nobody can publicly comment on your posts, which is, great for world leaders. There's not, on Twitter, people will react to it, positive, negative, and massively. Same on Facebook, even if you put in, the filters. But on Snapchat, nobody will publicly comment on your story. So I think it's very, very safe, and you reach exactly that. The younger voters. So I do think, for governments, for politicians, it might make sense to open a Snapchat account or an Instagram account and tell their stories visually. And that, I think, is the challenge in the future, be it Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. How do we tell stories visually with just a picture? And we're not even talking about 140 characters here. We're talking about a couple of emojis, a couple of words, a couple of hashtags on the picture, and drawings. How do you tell stories? Or in Snapchat, the videos are 10 seconds long. Which is like, make a statement in 10 seconds. If you're on Snapchat, follow Mauricio Macri. You will see that he gets his ministers and people to do 10-second statements. He even got Ivanka Trump at the G20 summit, and Justin Trudeau, the Canadian Prime Minister, to make these 10-second statements on his Snapchat channel. So check it out.
Can I just give a small anecdote and a broader point as a reply to your question, because I would not be competent to give an answer as you've given. My personal experience with my students and doing master's degrees who are about 21, 22 years old, to get them on Twitter is actually a tough job. And they look at me like, you're an old guy. You're on Twitter. We are not. So I'm hitting back at them. Facebook is for kids, but probably many of them, as you indeed indicate, they're at the point of abandoning Facebook and going elsewhere. The broader point is that it's very important for governments to keep an eye on communicative patterns in societies. And we are seeing, for the first time in history, society is in the lead. Society is in the lead, and government is following. If government wants to be relevant for society, they have to find out where people are, how they are, what are new trends in communicative behavior. And that is, I think, is a fascinating development. And by definition, makes governments laggards, because they are bureaucratic institutions that have to adapt to these very swift changes in communicative patterns in societies. So governments need people watching that all of the time.
Maurice, you had?
Yeah. About reaching the young people on social media, of course, Instagram and Snapchat are the platforms. But this puts, of course, a massive load on communication departments, because normally it will be one written piece and a picture, and once a year an extensive video. And now, for these platforms, you have to make a number of videos and a great picture, and it needs to be funny and informative as well, of course. So this is a massive load for the workforce. It's, of course, good for the communication professionals. But you see, and I'm talking about political communication in election time, but you see there is a difference in effectiveness, whether you use purely text, a video link, or a picture, or whatever. And it shows that using video is way more effective than text or a link or a picture.
Especially Facebook favors video in its algorithm right now. So, and look, this little device, is your OB van for those who remember TV production.
Yes.
You can shoot, you can go live, you can edit video on this on Instagram. The editing capabilities are quite good. If you shoot outside, actually, I've designed a social video workshop to help, clients understand what this powerful tool is. It's not just a telephone. I don't call anymore, but you can actually do amazing things with this. So and post them on social media. So you don't need that big production. The sound engineer and the light engineer. That's you can do it right there. And world leaders are doing it.
And so we are now at the end. So let me just toss it. All right, one more. Of course, Peter.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Matthias. Can I ask Jan a follow-up question? you describe as fascinating the trend where government is following in terms of these platforms. But isn't that good? I mean, in the longer term, apart from our professional interests and all that, isn't that good for society?
I think it is, yes. And you know, I sometimes also think governments are not, they're not necessarily following. If you have the distinction between governments and corporates, I think governments, MFAs, foreign ministry, are actually sometimes much further ahead than big corporations. You know, think about, you manage, the foreign ministry has to manage, their 50, 100 embassies around the world. They cannot approve every single tweet or post that is being posted, or they can't even command it. So I think this is, this distributed communication. Think about, in a corporation, which is very hierarchical, that is like almost unthinkable, to let everyone communicate like that. So I think governments are actually leading. Are they following? Well, some governments are faster in the adoption of these new tools. Others are, are a bit behind. But I think most of them will get there one day.
And we are at the close now, so let me. I guess, do you want to respond to that? He did
to this
tell us that,
particular
yes,
point,
he
yes,
did ask you a
very
question.
briefly. I think it is an existential necessity for foreign ministries also to be in these media. How important is a foreign minister in a country's national power hierarchy? In some countries, not so important. I think that in China, the foreign minister would rank about in the top 100, but not in the top 30 of most important people. In many other countries, governments are too eager to slice the budget of the foreign ministry. So looking for not having a domestic backyard like so many other government departments, to build on this domestic constituency, that is where social media are a fantastic instrument that diplomats and foreign ministry never had in the past.
And then let's end it with this, 1 or 2 sentences from each one of the gentlemen in terms of either a fearless prediction or what you want people to walk out of here with. And let's start, Maurice.
Keep on using social media, keep on analyzing social media. It's a fascinating platform, and we've barely scratched the surface of what you can do with it.
Jan?
Yes, I also think we barely scratched the surface, and we have to keep an eye on the importance of the digital literacy of our societies. Matthias used a wonderful word. We are digital immigrants. There are young people that we know that are digital natives. But to navigate in this environment is actually of importance in society, in politics, and that is where I think there is also a duty for governments to help with digital education to create resilient citizens.
And Matthias.
I would say, be curious, adopt those new tools that our children adopt. And I'm 53, and I told myself, I have 3 children, 16, 13, and a 7.5-year-old. I want to be on the social networks before they are. So I was on Snapchat before they were, and so we're connected. That's good. But so I think this is really important. Keep up with the times.
Fantastic. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the close of this panel, and giving a warm round of applause to our panel. Thank you, Maurice, Jan, and Matthias. And thank you,